easy or difficult is it going to be able to achieve that balance whereby these companies are seen to be paying the morally appropriate tax even whilst the government can boast of an investor-friendly regime? How do you strike that balance?
One way of doing it is to introduce something like, it's quite a dramatic measure, is a tax on turnover, a percentage. So that if you're generating substantial profits in a high tax jurisdiction like the UK, you compare what the percentage on turnover tax and what your actual tax is, and you pay the higher amount. It's a form of minimum alternative tax, if you like. That's quite controversial, but I'll tell you that that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to change the source of income in certain situations. Now, for example, a lot of the income we're talking about takes the form of two things. One is interest income, and two is royalty income.
Yes.
You can change the source of where royalties come, and if the royalties come from intellectual property that's usually actually developed, in a high tax jurisdiction before it's turned into an intangible asset, you can change the source of that. You can do the same with interest. In the UK, we have very generous rules for non-residents earning interest. You can change those rules to say that if a non-resident entity is earning interest, but there is a UK operation, you can link it like a representative of SSE and say we will tax through the UK operation. So these are simple ways of doing something without being too radical, but actually bringing into the UK tax net. And I'm obviously talking about the UK, but you can probably replicate this in other jurisdictions.
But when you talk about this, it's important to remember this isn't just a multinational corporation versus the UK. There are other countries who have an interest in this. So take the Starbucks example. Starbucks says we're voluntarily going to make a payment to the United Kingdom. But what happens if that profit that they're willing to leave in the United Kingdom and pay tax on actually belongs to the United States? Under what moral or legal framework does Starbucks get to say, we are going to take money that belongs to the Treasury in Washington and turn it over to the Treasury in London because the British government has made an issue with this? Remember, there are other actors here.
Yeah, which is my question. Mr. Mehta says that there are some simple ways to do it, but I wonder if there's anything simple at all, as long as you have jurisdictions which continue to boast of lower tax rates to attract investors. Companies will find structures that exploit that.
Right now, it's possible to move income to lower zero tax places where you don't do anything at all. Small shell companies in tiny, tax-favored jurisdictions. I think if you were to eliminate that opportunity so that you only could take advantage of lower tax rates in another country by actually moving physical or by actually performing physical functions there, you'd have much, much less revenue leakage.
Now that would be the death of the double Irish Dutch sandwich, a commonly used recipe for minimizing taxes. In Australia, Google cooks it like this: raising advertising invoices on an Irish subsidiary. The advertising income is taxable in Ireland according to the Australia-Ireland Tax Treaty. But the Irish subsidiary then pays a royalty to a Google Dutch subsidiary, which is then paid back to a second Irish holding company subsidiary controlled in Bermuda, a country that charges no corporate tax. The Australian revenue has no appetite for this sandwich.
There is one simple and rather drastic way to stop that, and that is for Australia to terminate the treaty with Ireland. That will switch that arrangement off, and to bring in domestic source rules for those internet-based companies. That will stop that leakage of revenue. It's a drastic measure, but Ireland is not a big economy. It's not the same as terminating the treaty with the US, which would never happen.
Some other country would take the place of Ireland, and Google would find another country to replace Ireland.
Well, terminating treaties happens. It happened with Indonesia and Mauritius, where Indonesia terminated the treaty with
How many such treaties can any country terminate if another country can easily step into Ireland's shoes?
Well, I don't know I don't know what countries will step into Ireland's shoes. It seems to be focused on Ireland.
I'm curious about why we don't talk about the fact that most of these countries, including Australia, has strong domestic anti-avoidance legislation. And so sometimes, Michael talks about amending the rules and changing the system, and I think some of that is obviously necessary. But how much of what we need to do is simply use the existing rules? I mean, Australia's anti-avoidance legislation is actually quite strong.
Well, it just got strengthened because
and so
I need to differ from my distinguished Canadian colleague. I think as long as we have attorneys with the skill of the gentleman to my left, I don't think that anti-avoidance rules, which tend to be phrased in very broad terms, are going to be very successful, because I think that judges, especially when prompted by good lawyers, will tend to say that if the fine lines in the law say that something seem clearly to say that something is permissible, it's very difficult for a judge on subjective grounds to say.
Maybe in the 19th century, not anymore.
Well, we'll see.
The problems in the international system, as Michael will agree, arise from the fact that our international system was designed on the tangible economy, where communication was poor and multinational operations in various jurisdictions were through autonomous subsidiaries. But today, with high-speed and high-quality information systems and communication systems, multinationals can operate in a very integrated manner, and the international tax system rules don't reflect that.
The internet and new business models have transformed economic activity, says Assistant Treasurer of Australia, David Bradbury. He says, in turn, this challenges some of the concepts that form the building blocks of our current international tax architecture: source, permanent establishments, and residency. The OECD is also examining the issues of base erosion and profit shifting, making for a multi-state approach. And different countries are working on plugging the gaps.
I think there's a growing consensus in both political parties in the United States that this problem needs to be dealt with somehow. My own view is that it will first be dealt with partially through tightening of controlled foreign corporation, CFC legislation, and then perhaps through a more comprehensive reform of transfer pricing rules. Politically, I think it will happen gradually, because I do think that it's sound economic policy for Congress to reduce the overall corporate tax rate as it is plugging these holes in the international tax system.
Well, as I said, there are different ways of tackling what Starbucks and others have been doing. So it might be something to equate foreign groups to the way we tax control foreign companies.
Okay.
I can't tell you precisely what that form will take, but there are different ways of doing it. But that will happen. And in the UK, we've had a curious reversal of this by way of precedent in recent years, where a number of UK corporate groups actually left the UK because they found the UK a terribly complicated place to do business tax-wise. Plus, the government were proposing to introduce very radical changes to the CFC legislation, including the taxation of intellectual property, which actually encouraged groups like, the most prominent one was the JWT, who went. But they've come back, because the government softened and they listened. What needs to happen here is the opposite of that, to say that you guys can stay in the UK, I'm talking about the Starbucks, etc., but here is what we expect you to do. Now, if you say that in legislation, I have no problem with that, because there's no morality involved in responding to it.
You spoke from an Australia point of view, but I do want you to conclude this discussion also in a sense to give those companies that operate on a global basis, and we have several of those kinds in India as well, on whether it is going to be possible, let's say 5 years down the line, to continue with profit shifting types of activities, to continue to exploit lower tax jurisdictions or jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands at all.
I think overall they're not going to be effective in the future. If the governments are able to operate as a combined block through through the OECD. The OECD is most likely to be the forum in which a response is going to come, but I don't think they'll be acceptable in the future.